From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Before the break, Monet was making the argument that the general elections sometimes have a way of surprising, and they have different dynamics than primaries do. The issues in the primary are not usually the issues that voters care about in the general election. And it is true that some of these races, even with Trump-endorsed candidates, are tightening. I would look at the Dr. Oz and John Fetterman race, Senate race in Pennsylvania, which looks more tight than it did, I think, a couple months ago. Kim, how do you sense this midterm election shaping up as people start to reckon with the binary choice that they're going to be facing on the ballot in November?
Yeah, we're now post-Labor Day, and that's a really important moment because it's when people begin to tune in. And when you end up getting things like today's inflation report, which I know we're going to talk about in a minute, it has a way of refocusing minds. I think that's what you're seeing in some of these polls that have shown up. And it isn't just in Pennsylvania. You see a lot of tightening in different places. There's a recent Emerson poll out of Arizona that has Mark Kelly, the senator there, the Democratic senator, up only by 2 points over the Republican who's running against him, Blake Masters. In Nevada, there's a poll showing Catherine Cortez Masto, the Democratic senator, only up by 1 over the Republican candidate. Ohio, Georgia, you see the GOP candidates tied or ahead. One thing I would note about this, too, a big important caveat. There was a great piece yesterday by Nate Cohn in the New York Times, who works on their polling team. They ran an analysis of how bad the 2020 polls were off, and they were off by a lot. If you looked at pretty much every single major state that had a race going on, a swing state, Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada, Arizona, Florida, Ohio, Iowa, they got the polling wrong by anywhere from 4 to 8 points. And they gave the example of how it's looking that way in some of the same states again, in that if you look at the dynamics, the Republicans really ought to be favored to win, and yet you're having these polls come up, one out of Wisconsin, for instance, saying that the Democrat in that race, Mandela Barnes, in the Senate race, was actually beating Ron Johnson, the incumbent senator, by 7 points. Now, that certainly sounds good if you're a Democrat, but Wisconsin, as Nate Cohn pointed out, this was a state where they got it wrong on Mr. Biden's win in 2020 by about 8 percentage points. So we'll see. We've obviously had a lot of notorious problems with polling in recent election cycles, especially 2016, but also this last cycle too. So if you talk to Republicans, their internal polling has things a lot closer to them ahead. And so I would take some of this too with a grain of salt.
The final point I would make on the midterm elections is that I think most people don't realize, but voting has already begun last Friday. North Carolina started sending mail ballots to people who'd requested them, about 50,000 people so far. And Monet, there are other states that are not far behind. Mail voting gets 50 days allotted in Pennsylvania, 47 in Wisconsin. And this is before many of these candidates have even debated, before the New Hampshire primaries are even finished. And in North Carolina, at least, the state says that once you return your ballot, you may not change or cancel your ballot. And so I'm left again with this question we often have when we're talking about election integrity and ballot access is, what is the limiting principle? How early is too early to cast a vote for the November elections?
Right. I mean, I think going back to 2020, we can all recall that state by state, there seemed to be really big differentials in who people were casting their votes for by mail versus in person. Most of that probably can be chalked up to the types of people who are more likely to vote by mail versus vote in person, as opposed to a kind of a shifting taste over time. But I think you definitely did see some of that, and it just kind of makes sense that there are still events unfolding. People are going to potentially be reevaluating these candidates as time goes on. And so if you open up voting to sort of the mass public long before the official election day, you're just creating a very strange dynamic that seems to kind of contradict the old American norm of having an election day where everyone is casting their votes at the same time based on the same information, where they've given it the maximum amount of time to consider their choice between the candidates candidates. And I do think that it's something that is going to lead to a lot of hand-wringing among the candidates and the general public, no matter how the votes turn out. I think the new vote-by-mail norm is something that we opened up for convenience during COVID, but now we're going to see the beginning of making it permanent, which is just going to lead to a lot of election chaos in the future.
Finally, the Labor Department this morning, released new numbers for the Consumer Price Index, which shows prices up 8.3% year over year. Kim, that is not, I think, the number that the Biden administration was hoping for. What sticks out to you in this inflation report?
How underlying inflation, what we call core inflation, which excludes food and energy costs, just how sticky inflation is remaining. You are seeing big prices in particular in like areas like services, cars, etc., that are just not going away. And, the Biden administration is going to point to, for instance, a further reduction that we saw in these numbers in energy prices, which people are certainly seeing when they go to the gas station, which is good. But to the extent that that number is where it is and hasn't been going up, it's largely only because we've seen a little bit of easing in that one particular area, gas prices. Everything else, inflation is really remaining. And it suggests that there's still a lot of pain going forward in terms of what consumers are going to have to handle, in terms of what the Fed may have to do to get this under control. And it's just bad news for the Biden administration, which of course just passed its Inflation Reduction Act. So obviously we all knew that that was a silly title and that it wasn't going to help, but probably only hurt inflation. Here is now some of your proof.
I'll point to a couple of the specific numbers that show people are really being hit by this inflation. The food index is up 11.4% year over year. We did get some reduction in gasoline last month, down 10.6%, but year over year it's still up 25.6%. And it looks to me, looking at these figures, like the year over year average is still being propped up somewhat by the explosive inflation we had in the past a year, 6 months ago. But the core inflation number, and this is minus food and energy, and again, economists look at this to give a better sense of the underlying trend because food and energy tend to be volatile for reasons other than what you would call inflation. That is still really sticky, to use the word that Kim says. All items less food and energy is up 0.6% in the month of August. That compares to 0.3 in July, 0.7 in June, and 0.6 in May. And so when the 0.3 came in July, we had a podcast, and I think I said, we'll have to see whether this holds or whether this is a blip in the data. And we see an increase again in August. And Monet, lo and behold, that is what we are looking at right now.
Right. I think it's interesting to think back to a month ago when President Biden and the White House were celebrating zero inflation, quote unquote, because month to month there was no increase. That is from June to July, there was no increase. But the reason for that was that we saw a pretty big decline in gasoline prices, which was by far the biggest driver of the inflation that we had previously been seeing month to month. And that decline in gasoline prices was just more than enough to offset increases in a whole bunch of other categories. So you still do have core inflation, as Kim said, continuing to increase. A whole bunch of hard goods that sort of people consume every day, along with food, that has also increased and has not decreased a single time, basically since the broad inflation trend started over a year ago at this point. And so it does seem as if the fundamental factors that are driving inflation are still roaring. Consumer spending has started to level off and even decrease, but not nearly as much as you would need to offset the increase in prices that we're seeing. And it does seem as if the gas price trend is not necessarily a bellwether of decreases across the rest of the economy so far. And so that's why you saw the markets reacting today. It's very clear that inflation is stickier than some people hoped based on the fairly solid data from July. And so that obviously means that the Fed is expected to stay its course with 75 basis point increase in the next meeting, and probably is even going to be thinking about increasing its target right now.
Well, I agree with that. It does seem like this is a report that is was clarifying for Jay Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, the chair of the Federal Reserve. Kim, I mean, the other thing that strikes me is just the political impact on that. I think the Biden administration was very much hoping that inflation would continue to ease as we got toward November and that voters would have other things on their mind when they got into the ballot box. And it seems like this is continuing to see elevated price increases, and we'll have to see how long that lasts through November. But it does seem like the Biden administration is continuing to have a real inflation problem politically. And Kim will give you the last word.
Yo, absolutely. This is not the report that they wanted to see today, because as you mentioned, if it had simply come out and eased some, just a bit, like really a kind of downward trajectory of some form or fashion, they could say, see, it's working, progress is being made, stick with us, and we'll get there. Instead, we're just treading water. And you've got a lot of Americans who this is really beginning to hurt. Also, we're headed into colder months. Those energy bills are going to be going up again as people have to heat their homes. And, the food, a lot of the items here are things that people absolutely need. They are basic pocketbook issues. So this is going to hurt Democrats going forward because it risks as well dominating some of the other issues that they would like to instead have front and center on the ballot, things like abortion.
Thank you, Kim and Monet. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we will be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.